Hello, history seekers. Did you know the story behind the word algorithm is tied to a medieval scholar whose work still powers computers today? In the next, we'll trace how Moorish scholars, engineers, and physicians in medieval Iberia preserved ancient knowledge, advanced science, and wired Europe for the Renaissance, and why much of that African and Arab contribution was later erased. If you love hidden history, hit subscribe and ring the bell. The Arrival and the Long Rule: How the Moors Changed Iberia. When Muslim armies crossed into Iberia in 711, they didn't simply conquer territory. They inherited a multilingual, multi-ethnic landscape and set up a network of cities and institutions that lasted centuries. Cordoba rose as a capital of learning and administration. Cordoba's streets lit at night, its baths and bazaars humming with scholars and merchants, and its courts commissioning works in Arabic, Latin, Hebrew, and Romance tongues. The so-called Moors included North Africans, Arabs, Iberian converts, and sub-Saharan Africans. The people and ideas that flowed through Andalusia were far from monolithic. Science, numbers, and the birth of algebra, Al-Khwarizmi's texts on algebra and Hindu-Arabic numerals reached Europe via Latin translations in the 12th century. The Latinized forms of his name gave us algorithm and later algorithm. But that single etymology points to a much bigger truth. Mathematical methods and number systems developed across the Islamic world and South Asia were synthesized, taught, and spread from places like Cordoba and Toledo, enabling bookkeeping, astronomy, navigation, and later, mechanical computation. These numerical tools underpinned commercial expansion and the scientific experiments that followed in later centuries. Hospitals, medicine, and surgical practice. In Moorish Spain, hospitals were institutions of care and learning. Hospitals that trained physicians, maintained medical libraries, and practiced techniques far more advanced than many of their European contemporaries. Surgeons in Andalusia used cautery and, at times, anesthetic substances. Doctors compiled medical encyclopedias and surgical manuals that Christian and Jewish physicians read in translation. The medical corpus preserved and extended Galenic, Hippocratic, Indian, and Persian knowledge, making Iberia a crossroads for practical medicine that Europeans later adapted. Cities, water, and urban comforts. Walk through a Moorish city and you would meet cisterns, aqueduct-fed fountains, public baths, street lighting, and shaded gardens. Urban comforts tied to sophisticated water management and engineering. Techniques such as Qanat-derived irrigation systems, acequias, and water wheels allowed agriculture and urban life to flourish even in arid zones. Those technologies supported denser populations and higher literacy because stable food and sanitation free up resources for learning. By contrast, many northern European towns lacked comparable public hygiene for centuries. Libraries, translation, and the Toledo School, one of the most consequential legacies of Muslim Iberia, was institutionalized translation. After the Reconquest pushed Christian polities into formerly Muslim cities, translators in Toledo and elsewhere began rendering Arabic texts into Latin and Castilian. Works on medicine, philosophy, astronomy, and mathematics, often themselves translations of Greek or Indian originals, entered the hands of European scholars. The transmission was not a simple handoff. Translators and scholars compared versions, corrected errors, and added commentaries that made the texts useful to medieval Europe's nascent universities. Trade, luxury, and material culture, silks, spices, glass mirrors, sugar, refined ceramics, and sophisticated textile techniques flowed through Andalusian ports and markets into northern Europe. Luxury items brought new tastes, but more importantly, the trade networks carried techniques and ideas. Glass-blowing knowledge aided science, textile patterns influenced European fashions, and sugar cultivation altered economies. This material flow also reshaped social rituals, dining etiquette, tableware, and the aesthetics of domestic spaces, creating cultural bridges between Mediterranean societies. The moral economy, rule, law, and religious pluralism. Under many Muslim rulers, law and administration relied on a combination of Sharia, customary practices, and pragmatic governance that handled diverse populations. Protected communities, notably Jews and Christians, could practice religion and engage in commerce. And this pluralism created legal and social spaces where knowledge exchange flourished. At times, the relative tolerance was instrumental for cross-cultural scholarship. Jewish translators, knowing Arabic and Latin, became mediators for texts that fueled European learning, education, pedagogy, and public knowledge. Schools, madrasas, and cathedral schools in Iberia often competed and cooperated. Moorish institutions trained scribes, astronomers, and jurists. Their libraries held Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Latin manuscripts, copies, and commentaries that might have otherwise vanished. The pedagogical practices, problem sets in mathematics, clinical cases in medicine, annotated commentaries influenced how knowledge was taught once those texts entered European curricula. In short, Andalusia was a classroom whose lessons would travel north, the intellectual crossroads, figures, and texts. Beyond Al-Khwarizmi, many named and anonymous scholars matter. Physicians whose casebooks informed later surgeons, astronomers whose tables improved navigation, lexicographers and translators who preserved Greek philosophy. Gerard of Cremona and others made pilgrimages to Toledo to find lost works. Their Latin translations became standard textbooks in European universities. The chain of custody for classical thought. Greek texts give Syriac, Persian, Arabic commentaries gives Arabic originals, and syntheses gives Latin translations. Explains how the Renaissance recovered, then reworked classical knowledge, race, memory, and the erasure of Black African legacy. Important to stress, the population and leadership of Muslim Iberia included people of sub-Saharan African origin, whether enslaved, freed, or free. African presence in courts, armies, and cities was real, yet later, European historiography often flattened or erased that fact. This erasure matters because it obscures the full ethnographic and intellectual reality of the region and deprives modern readers of a truthful lineage linking Africa to European scientific developments. Recent scholarship and Black history projects have been working to restore those voices and labor to the record. Science in practice, astronomy, navigation, and instruments, astronomical tables. The astrolabe, improved maps, and mathematical techniques enabled more accurate navigation and calendrical calculation. Mariners and mapmakers used instruments and tables developed or refined in the Islamic world. Knowledge that Europeans absorbed and adapted during the 12th to 14th centuries. These technical gains were incremental but cumulative. Better instruments enabled longer voyages, which in turn enabled the eventual age of exploration. Law, commerce, and the business of knowledge. Paper, bookkeeping practices enabled by Hindu-Arabic numerals, and legal frameworks for contracts strengthened commercial life in Iberia. Merchants kept accounts, partnerships, and wills. Such record-keeping required numeracy and literacy that literacy centers helped foster. Trade law and maritime instruments that began in Mediterranean ports were shared and improved across cultures, creating conditions where scientific knowledge could be applied to real economic questions. The turning point: reconquest, translation, and transmission. As Christian polities reconquered major cities, the physical libraries and technical communities did not instantly vanish. Rather, their contents were repurposed, translated, and disseminated. The translation movement in places like Toledo was a turning point. It made Arabic science available in Latin at a time when Northern Europe needed textbooks. That movement didn't create the science, but it unlocked the door for it to be taught in universities, prompting the slow, uneven rise of a European scholarly tradition that eventually called itself Renaissance. The tangible inheritance is clear: numerals, algebraic methods, medical encyclopedias, irrigation systems, urban comforts, and a vigorous textual tradition. The less tangible inheritance is cultural attitude, the idea that inquiry, commentary, and cross-linguistic scholarship were legitimate intellectual labor. What was lost or obscured were names, faces, and the diversity of contributors, including many Africans and women who rarely made it into medieval chronicles. Recovering that past helps us see how interconnected medieval history really was. When telling this history, anchor it on a few figures. Al-Khwarizmi for mathematics. Physicians whose manuals circulated in translation. Translators like Gerard of Cremona, who ferried knowledge north, and the anonymous librarians and copyists who preserved texts. Names help listeners map cause and effect. Translation begets textbooks. Textbooks beget curriculum. Curriculum begets new scientists. So what should we take away? First, the scientific and cultural foundations of Europe are multivalent. They include Islamic, African, and classical threads braided together. Second, erasure is a political act that changes how societies remember their past. If you found this revealing, comment below. Which Moorish contribution surprised you most, and who should we profile next? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more stories.